The Shadow in Apartment 303. When Jess found her new apartment in the heart of the city, she couldn't believe her luck. It was spacious, affordable, and came with a beautiful view of the city skyline. The building was old, but had character, with narrow hallways, creaky floorboards, and a vintage charm that she found oddly comforting. Apartment 303 was the last unit at the end of the hall, adding a sense of privacy that Jess loved. On her first night, after she had settled in, she felt an odd chill in the air. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly, and she swore she saw a shadow flicker in her peripheral vision. Assuming it was just nerves from being in a new place, she brushed it off and went to bed. A few nights later, Jess woke up around 3 a.m. to an unsettling feeling that she wasn't alone. Her eyes darted around the room, and that's when she saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner, facing her bed. The figure was tall, almost stretching to the ceiling, with indistinct features and a darkness that seemed to absorb the faint light of her bedside lamp. Frozen in fear, Jess stared at the shadow, her heart pounding. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, as if watching her, feeding off her terror. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it was just a trick of her imagination. When she opened them again, the shadow was gone. The following day, Jess dismissed the experience as a sleep-induced hallucination, convincing herself it had just been a nightmare. But over the next few weeks, strange occurrences became routine. Items would go missing and then reappear in odd places, and she often found doors and cabinets open that she was certain she had closed. One night, as she was cooking dinner, Jess felt a sudden chill behind her. She turned slowly and saw the shadow standing in the hallway, closer this time, almost within arm's reach. She dropped her spatula, stumbling back, watching as it melted into the darkness around it, disappearing without a sound. Terrified, Jess confided in her neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Rivera, who had lived in the building for decades. Mrs. Rivera's face grew pale as Jess recounted her experiences. She told Jess that many years ago, a young man named Marco had lived in apartment 303. Marco was a troubled soul, often seen pacing the halls at odd hours, muttering to himself. One night, after a particularly loud argument with someone no one else could see, he was found dead in his apartment. Since then, tenants in 303 had reported strange encounters with a shadow, all describing it the same way, a tall, featureless figure that just stood and watched. Jess's skin prickled with fear, but she decided to stay, unwilling to let an old story frighten her out of her new apartment. She began sleeping with the lights on and even put salt along her windowsills, hoping to keep the shadow at bay, but the shadow grew bolder. One night, Jess woke up to the feeling of cold fingers brushing her face. Gasping, she saw the shadow looming above her, its hand reaching out as if to touch her again. She tried to move, but her body was paralyzed with fear. The shadow leaned closer, and she could feel the air around her grow thick, her breath becoming shallow as a cold weight settled over her chest. Desperate, she whispered, "Please, leave me alone." The shadow recoiled slightly, fading into the corner of the room. That was when she heard it, a soft, almost mournful whisper.
"Help me."
Terrified but curious, Jess spoke to Mrs. Rivera again. She learned that Marco had been estranged from his family and had lived in isolation. He had often complained of feeling invisible, ignored, and forgotten. Some tenants believed that Marco's spirit was trapped in the apartment, a shadowy remnant of his loneliness and despair, reaching out to anyone who might acknowledge his presence. Determined to end the haunting, Jess returned to her apartment and sat in the dark, calling out, "Marco, I'm here, I see you." The air around her grew cold, and the shadow reappeared in the corner, watching her, but somehow it seemed less menacing this time. She continued, "You're not alone. I'm listening." The shadow seemed to ripple, its form wavering before disappearing altogether. That night, for the first time since moving in, Jess slept peacefully. Though she stayed in the apartment, she never saw the shadow again. But every so often, late at night, she would feel a faint chill, like a presence passing through, as if Marco were finally finding his way out of the darkness. The story of the shadow in apartment 303 reminds us that some spirits are bound not by anger or malice, but by sorrow and a desire to be seen. And sometimes the greatest terror isn't in the shadow itself, but in what or who it used to be.